You are listening to Art Destinations, a podcast where we host fortnightly conversations with artists and thinkers living and or working on islands to see how these unique places shape imaginations. This season is set in Lutruwita, Tasmania, following on from our Venice series. Hello, my name is Sarah Rhodes, an artist based in Lutruwita. This is the second part of our two-part conversation with Raymond Arnold. The conversation naturally shaped itself into two main themes, so we divided his podcast into two 35-minute parts. Here in part 2, Raymond talks about his printmaking and painting and how he shares his art practice with his community in Queenstown with the aim of revitalising the region. In part 1, Raymond gave us some background on why Tasmania is such an important landscape and how it became an environmental battleground. For the listeners who have never been to Queenstown, it is an extremely isolated town on Lutruwita's west coast, surrounded by forest and mountain ranges. It is now a landscape healing after bearing scars from an energetic copper extraction and smelter operation starting at the turn of the 20th century, which left the surrounding mountains bare and the rivers polluted. In the late 1990s, Raymond left teaching at the Tasmanian School of Art and moved to Queenstown with his partner, Helena Demczuk. Since then, they have focused on their art practices and use art to revitalise the town. Raymond Arnold is represented by Australian Galleries and Bet Gallery in Hobart. You can see Raymond's work on our Instagram page at artdestinations.podcast. Subscribe to Art Destinations on your hosting platform so you don't miss an episode, and even leave a review. Your contribution supports us. You get an enormous amount done in a day, or in your lifetime, really. But I was listening to the talk you gave at the QV Mag yesterday, and you were talking about all the projects that you're going to do by March, even. I'm focusing on one or two at a time, but you really can move a lot of ideas. So, how do you manage your day? How do you actually fit all of that?
Yeah, it's a challenge is getting into my, I'm 75 next year, so I need a few naps through the day now. But look, I'm just driven by it. It's my whole life, really. No children, completely focused on how I might be productive in the day on my own terms or with others. There's a very early dog walk. My partner and our 4 whippets, we're in the hills, so we're getting us sort of tasting the air for the day, walking through the snow or the heavy rain. Or this year, it's an incredible season for flowers and things blooming we've never seen before. We couldn't believe this tree we saw recently that a friend thinks is a sort of type Tasmanian currant. So we're up early into it, and then it's a coffee and a little nap again. And then the morning, I quite like the morning. If I've got to write something, you can concentrate early on the computer, or if I'm working on an etching, which requires you to sit at a desk, it's a bit like writing a book. You've got to just be there at the desk, and that's a sort of quite nice way to work through things. And then it's a lunch, and quite a big lunch, really. I'd moved my parents to Queenstown not long after I moved there. My father was dementing, and my poor little mother was struggling with that in Melbourne. So my sister and I sort of helicoptered them into Queenstown. In retrospect, one of the hardest things I've ever done was to sort of try and manage that. And he slowly got worse and got put in secure aged care, a couple of hours away, I'd see. And then she started to fall, and she ended up in the local Lyle house. But quite early on in bringing them to Queenstown, we realised they weren't eating. My mother was a little mouse of a thing, and he was a big guy, and she'd give him a half her banana or something. I think that was enough. So we started these lunches, and I'd walk them down to and whoever was in town, journalists or artists, would be sitting at the table. My father would look at them with this quizzical look. Who the hell are these people? But he's quite a social guy as well in the moment. And so, yeah, I think it was good for them in other ways, that meeting. we have a good lunch, and it's sort of remained, even though they've been gone 10 years. The lunches are important. Then it's a bit of Press West work, which is our community workshop. There's generally things to pack away or put up, particularly if we're heading towards a workshop. There's artwork to put up. And then it's painting, either out on the road or up on the hills. And at the moment it's in the studio after that initial foray out in the landscape. And then it's a break, a drink, and a little bit of a supper and news, and then it's a bit more work, sometimes a bit inebriated as well, but I can get back to hand colouring and etching for 30 or 40 minutes, and and then it's a little bit of streaming, some interesting things. Lots of reading all the time, amazing books. We're into Andrew O'Hagan, the Scottish writer at the moment, wonderful writing.
So your secret seems to be micro doses of different things to keep everything fresh. You're not wasting time by lingering too long on one task.
No, we're not driving anywhere. The car sits there for 2 or 3 weeks between the trips out. The milk is 100 metres away. Everything's so central and focused. For a long, long time, I've been absolutely focused on not having any this and that in one's life, in a way. This is where I live, this is where I work, this is where I recreate, this is my studio. It comes from my teaching days as a young man, and it was absolutely intense through the week, and then you'd collapse on the weekend, get your migraine, and then you'd try and do your own painting, and then you'd be back into it. And so I just wanted something quite seamless in a way, a lifestyle. And it sort of started on my first trip here again. It had the clarity of that early trip to Tasmania, where we staggered out of the mountains with these young kids, cold and wet, and it had snowed that summer, that Christmas Day. We were walking in. And the ranger at Lake St Clair, and it's before we're all in army surplus stuff, and you had Japara jackets. It's before this whole Gore-Tex pay to get through the park stuff. And the ranger put us into different accommodation at Lake St Clair, and I ended up being in this beautiful little cabin that was obviously one of the rangers, and he was away. And his photographs were on the wall, and I saw there was his enlarger around the corner in the little laundry, and here with all these books. And it was like some Walden Pond, like some sort of cabin out of philosophy. This is how you lived in nature. You lived a sort of creative, active life, but here it was all around you in a way. It was such a lesson to me in a way, and increasingly I've thought of it. And I guess I've tried to remake it here in the Queenstown Valley, really, in this old school. Architecture is important, the building's important, but it's all there like a sort of an extra skin or extra clothing you put on. It's around you and everything's close, and I'm not differentiating between going off to work there or... It's almost like an existential sort of in the moment sort of life, because there's no stepping into some other condition or something.
You're bringing the community to you for your socialisation, I guess, and your stimulation, and you're making your work, and you're bringing experts into the town. Yeah. I also noticed at the QV Mag they were asking you to come to Launceston, but why would you do that when you're wanting them to come to you?
Yeah. I didn't quite understand. I understood it, but I certainly wasn't going down that.
No.
Yeah.
So the Press West, you've sort of skirted around a little bit about what you intended to do, but maybe you could just explain a little bit about what that project is and what, if people wanted to participate, what is being offered there.
Yeah. Well, the precedent for Press West were Helena and I, in that ambition to attract other artists, we set up Landscape Art Research Queenstown, and I just retired from the university, taken early retirement in a sort of fugue, in almost in anger in a way, in sort of a frustration of where I'd cornered myself in that domain of the academic. I've been going to France a lot, and things blew up in a way. I'd had a beautiful house built on Mount Nelson, and my relationship struggled. Anyway, things all came unwound in a way. So we headed off to the west. Landscape art research was a little bit of a joke, really, because it was such a high and mighty thing at the university. It drove everything. It funded everything, the research projects. So we put the research word in there. And we ran that. We said we'd run it for 10 years, not quite believing we could last that long. Again, because of that thing about how long can we hang in here. But it did, and it grew. We had about 60 exhibitions over that time and 30 or 40 visiting artists. We tried to get an international artist each year. And by 2015, the festivals were starting. Had Travis's festival, the first Unconformity, I think, might have been 16 or could have been 14, I'm not sure. They were starting to step in. So we sort of stepped back a bit and we thought we could sort of work on our own things, our painting and our own work. But then a guy arrived in town about 2020, I suppose, maybe, yeah, with some big lithographic presses on a trailer. And then another guy was talking about literacy and running programs through the local library hub in a way. And we thought this sort of idea of putting some of these things together. And then I started to think, look, I've got all this equipment. I've got this big etching press weighing a ton, I'm thinking, how can I sort of pay this forward in a way? I'm starting to think like someone who's going to leave the world in the next decade. What can I do about these things? So I'm thinking, it needs to be in a public hands in a way, or in some more accessible position. So things came together that we could establish something we call Press West. And the council, we approached them about a space I could see at this old school site that was neglected and empty.
Right in the centre of town. Right
in the centre of town, yeah. And so they spent $100,000 on it, getting it ready for us, new toilets, and it was unbelievable. We didn't ask for those things. We just asked to get in there, and again I was sort of reliving an early 80s chameleon experience of being allowed to get into some old neglected, forgotten property, like in that case the Blunstone building, and just expecting to have to sweep up all the dust. But no, they looked after us beautifully. And the arrogance of youth, you hardly think of what happens to you when you get old, or the fact that you might get old. It hardly crosses your mind in a way. Well, I had an artist friend who tried to commit suicide, and I thought, nobody's keeping an eye on her or looking after her. So we've got to look after ourselves in a way. So I thought that this old artist home started to sort of form up. And for a long time I thought it would be at East Devonport, above the sea there, until we got bedded into Queenstown. And then this Press West is in this old school, but in fact it's only in a fraction of this old school, 1938. Press West became, in my mind, a sort of Trojan horse into the bigger site. So we've done a lot of work, with particularly being supported by Robert Morris Nunn, a Hobart architect, a lot of pro bono work for him and his cohort of trainees and students. We've had architects there making work, and quite recently we met the Minister for Finance, the Federal Minister for Finance, Katie Gallagher, visited and talked to us about the project. So who knows? where it's going, but we've got that as a sort of concept in our minds.
I like this approach, which I have to say I like it because it resonates with me. It's sort of how I work, where you have something at the front of your mind or the back of your mind that you work towards, rather than having these sort of structured 5-year plans. But you've just got all the energy and emotion and passion for something, and it just sort of letting all your decisions focus on that, and then I don't know.
Yeah, no, I understand. It makes me think of, as I said, I did quite a bit of teaching in the 70s, and you'd see nothing for your enormous efforts apart from the migraine you'd get on a Saturday, which testified to how hard you'd focused on it. You'd see nothing. There'd be no sense of, maybe good teachers can have a sense of how good they are through their reflected student work, but once I found serious art making through a serious art school, the instant hit of achievement with the work, you'd do this and you'd get that, and wow, I was sort of like a druggie, hooked on it. And I knew that's what I wanted to do. So, and in a way, it was the work, this sort of conduit into this sort of work was just a reflection of watching my father work.
Yeah, so
I got apart from when he tried to mow the lawns and the mower wouldn't start, and then I saw the mower fly through the air past my window. Apart from that incredible burst of anger that he could come up, he was always working. He was always painting cars, sign writing, trucks. My memory of him is he's in his overalls working all the time. So I guess, and he was also quite interesting. He ran neighbourhood houses, he ran the Scouts, he was quite committed to a sort of community projects, which I wasn't. And he ran the social club at this huge factory, air conditioning factory he worked at. Our house was full of all these hundreds of presents that were going to be given out to the factory workers' kids. He'd go off and buy them each year. So, yeah, I think of him and all his work, and both at a brush paint level, but also in that broader connecting way.
So was he a creative thinker like you? Or, because he obviously was technically strong with his making, was it just more that time where he, it was a time when you're more needing to just provide?
I think it's that, Sarah. He was too young to go sent off to New Guinea or something, although he was, as a 17-year-old, he was in a timber mill, which was a sort of one of those professions or occupations that was deemed essential for the war effort or something. So his younger brother went to Japan in the occupation forces at the end of the war. Yeah, so hard-working. That generation had to fight their way out of that trauma of war in a way. Yeah, the generations of men in my family, my father's father, had one arm and one leg. The French call them the mutilé. He lost his arm in a chaff cutter working on a farm. The box collapsed under him and his arm went into this chaff cutter. And then he was getting through a fence with his gun and it had a hair trigger and it sort of destroyed one of his legs. His wife's father, my great-great-grandfather, had no legs from amputations for a trench foot in the First World War, which I've spoken about and made some work about in France. Yeah, so there's... It's amazing I've got any haven't got any bits missing. And my father, there's even a rumour now he was adopted. My sister's spreading this rumour around.
So how did he feel about you becoming an artist after, having to be working so hard?
Yeah, he was okay. He was okay with that. I think sons and fathers don't get on too well, I don't think. My mother said to me one day, "Why don't you talk to your father?" It was a bit of a shock to me to hear it, because I just assumed that's what you did. You didn't, which is unfortunate, isn't it? I got on a bit more with my grandfather on my mother's side. In fact, they brought me up a bit because both my parents were working all the time. And he was more directed about prejudiced, I guess, about the artist and there's no future in being an artist. You've got to be a naval officer. So I did try to get into that. Oh my God.
I imagine.
Yeah, so in terms of expectations, that grandfather generation was a bit more pushy than my father. Yeah, how did we got there? Well, that was one of the questions, wasn't it? So anyway, we did cover that.
You're working in painting, but you're also working in this multi-panel etching, or actually multi-panel paintings as well. How do your ideas differ with each medium that you're using?
Yeah, painting and printmaking. One's a bit more about work and connected to what we were just talking about. One is very labour intensive, sort of industrial in a way at its most extreme, where you're using, and well, certainly when I was training and certainly into most of my work, using chemicals and solvents, and you've got to pad up against those sorts of things. It is work, real work, whereas painting is it's more cerebral in a way, and more just that liquidy substance at the end of a brush is delicate and be pushed around. And a little more unfathomable in a way about what you can do. Each moment is a question about what to do, what colour, what mark, what are you trying to say anyway, or what's this? Whereas the printmaking, you're on a sort of train that's rolling along, and a lot of the decisions are being made for you in that process, which I've always loved. Things just appear in front of you, and you say, yes, that's the way to go with it. Working initially on an etching is a bit like writing, like an author must feel. You've got this tablet in front of you, the copper plate with the ground, and it might require a month's worth of work, like very delicate, consistent work. So a little more contrived in a way, whereas the painting is a bit more expressive. And for me, the painting initially was a way of being in nature, being out in the world. It's never really been about studio painting.
You're doing plein air.
Yeah. Particularly when I was teaching, it was a way, particularly when I started in the country, it was a way of just getting out of that pressure of the week and sitting, painting and working. And then certainly as the printing and the printmaking became more intensive and super industrial around thousands of screen printing, I just had to get away from it. And the painting, plein air was a way of doing that. Sometimes just in the old factory in Hobart, I could just walk over into the gardens and into the rose bed and work there. And then as I developed the residencies, the Savage River one I was talking about, I needed to sort of say to these people I was living within who I was, what I did. They were mechanics, they were housewives, they were truck drivers. So the obvious thing for me was to sit there painting in front of them with a beret on. And then as my studio turned into a sort of community art school for kids after school or older sick women, Audrey, this lovely Audrey, I needed to sort of be clearly visible making the pictures, whereas printmaking, it wouldn't have done that. Easel, paint, beret. The Max Angus approach. Yeah, but increasingly in Queenstown, in this valley, the painting has become much more important. initially for those same reasons I just mentioned, that here I am as this sort of stranger in town. What's he doing here? And what's this strange building he's developed? And the painting again was a badge or something, or as a way of saying who I was, an emblem. And then I won the Glover just a year or two after being in Queenstown of the local timber mill, the Hue and Pine, Western Mountain Ecologies, I think I might have called it. Wow, people brought me flowers. There's some moment in the pub, somebody saw that on the TV. They have it on the news, don't they, that announcement? And wow, it was terrific. The painting took me to a sort of place, to my place.
You were accepted by the community.
Yeah,
then.
in that community, yeah.
Oh, well, just quickly continuing on about the paintings and the printmaking, there's a different feeling when you're making each because, one's freer and looser and one's more sort of process-driven. But is the subject matter different? Obviously the subject matter is similar because you're related to the landscape around you. But are you trying to talk about different things in the landscape?
Yeah, I think so. The printmaking was a great rush into process through my study of it initially in that late 70s period, which coincides with a sort of, as we take in this great wash of influences from around through books initially, the internet doesn't exist, and that cliche now of most artists, and Emmons Tellers did a big work about this, where you learn about art history through small photo printed images in books in a way, and so your sense of scale and is all over the place. So, but for me, that incredible rise of the photo in the 70s, I was buying all sorts of photo magazines, and the photographic genre and the process of photography was quite interesting to me, and it was conceptualised in interesting ways during the 70s as well. Seriality. It is also quite process-driven as well. So there was these things coming together as I was studying around the Americans and those rephotographic projects, which were about landscape but also about history and about process and those incredible cameras they used and the stains of the chemical around the edges of the frame and et cetera, et cetera. So I'm taking that into the printmaking, the sort of, as I said, it's process-driven and you're constructing things and building things and trying to extend things. And how will it go if I paint colour onto top of that already inked up plate, and what it will look like under the enormous pressure of the press. But at the same time, you're thinking, I'm dealing with these surfaces, these flat surfaces, so my image has to sort of embellish that, and it has to sort of conceptualise that sense of it being a surface and being not so much an illusion of a landscape, but an illusion of a surface. And so that tiling comes from that very early days of putting together prints that acknowledge the photograph and the strange word capture that's used with photography. And so in that construction of a surface, you're starting to think about, to some extent, the poetry of it as well. Although, there's that famous Wallace Stevens, the poetry is the subject of the poem, in that blue guitar homage to Picasso, the poetry is the subject of the poem. So you're really taken by that idea that the print is the subject of the print and there's nothing else matters really. You're dealing with the print and what the idea of the print is. Nothing about anything else really. And so the print drifts off into this esoteric world, a little bit divorced from that world of cloud and heat and rain and the painted subject And as I said, it's generally at a desk. Although there was a guy, he's hopeless now, but he was a wonderful younger artist. There's an image from the 1976 or something, with landscape screen printing, It's just fantastic. He had a great sense of humour, but there he is out there in, landscape screen printing. I can't remember, probably just as well. I can't quite remember his name, but I just saw something this week. Yeah, so you do get taken into different zones with the two different sort of mediums in a way. And at one time through the 1990s, as I'm starting to go to Paris and then returning to Tasmania and working a semester or two, I start making work where I'm trying to combine these sort of different zones of the real and the constructed, and I start making prints that are in relation to objects as sort of installations. I did about 8 or 9 of them. They're still sitting, in my studio there, wrapped up or whatever. I was sort of trying to bring the things together a bit. It's not so much painting and printmaking, but it was about the real and the constructed or something, the real that would throw a shadow onto the print, but the print is sort of reflecting the sculptural object that was throwing the shadow. There was a sort of reciprocation going on and a sort of slightly closed system that didn't almost need a viewer in a sense.
Interesting. It sounds like printmaking has similar challenges to photography in terms of working with a 2D. It's different because photography is more literal than printmaking, but you've still got this sort of flat plane. Yeah,
for sure. And the painting is much more physical in a way. Most of my serious painting is built on the diptych format, it's my go-to position to say this is a physical thing. These are and also there's an echo of the tiling that the prints began, of this sitting next to that. But and the prints, because of that longevity of process and making, they become sort of diaries in a sense, because they take so long, particularly as I started to go west here. Probably my best work. It's hard for an artist to say that, but it's called Imaginary Landscape, and I made it in the aftermath of that turbulence. Started it almost as soon as I got home from those dam protests. Started on my kitchen table up in my little flat in Mount Nelson. But it's a series of panels about this panoramic image, partly based on my walking into Frenchman's Cap, which is above the Franklin. It's a sort of the fantastic fulcrum that Franklin tries to get around, but also a bit made up from different. It's got some Cape Rail dolerite cliffs in it, and in fact, in the title it says, what does it say? Figure ground or something. Franklin River, 18 months in Tasmania or something like that. So that's how long it took to make it, like almost 2 years. Yeah, so the prints particularly become a sort of a diaristic sort of story. And the one that it's almost my swan song in a way, my last serious work. It's now in the Launceston Museum at Royal Park. It's really in that zone of this story that develops over a decade. It took a decade to make it. So every little mark on it is my arm, my now, ruined neck and elbow, marking that plate and then printing it and then marking it again, printing again.
So how many panels in that work?
There 214 or something, yeah.
That's a lot. So did you know how big it was going to be when you were making it?
No.
Just evolved?
Yeah, it did.
It's a similar theme. Yeah, I like that.
Helena and I had a little routine of camping up on Mount Lyell for about 4 years. We would go up for the Christmas week, carry everything up, stay up there for a few days and then come down for a shower and go back up. And we would make some work up there. And about 2011, I took some plates up and began some drawing up there onto the plates. And that sort of began from there. But I was looking for a way of balancing that. I had this work that I'd made that I just mentioned before I think it's probably my most important work. Or somebody will say that at some point. And it was a work I did on my kitchen table in Hobart about the West Coast and about all these issues that we've sort of covered a bit this morning. This imaginary place, and very few people will get to, certainly in terms of a national, global audience. And I came and went into that zone and made the work in Hobart. But the work that this big 200 panel thing, I live in the middle of it in a sense. I live in that landscape now. And I think it's quite different because of that in a way. I'm not sort of owning it in a way. It's more part of me or something, in a sort of not in a consumptive way or something.
I actually think that's quite interesting because there are a lot of artists that live in big cities who are making work about places on the edge or, outlying places. And I do wonder what that work would be like if they were actually embedded in the landscape, how much that might shift, because it's definitely a different way of being.
Yeah. Cézanne's probably the credible figure that you'd think about in that artist painting his that world around him, that landscape around him, the mountain and the Victoire, and yeah.
So your image titles are very, I don't know how to describe them, but they really sort of pique your imagination. They're very beautiful, road to other, elsewhere world, imaginary landscapes. So what are you trying to say, or what is the role of these titles? They don't have boundaries. They're not rigid.
There's no sort of specificity around the title, no. They've sort of evolved over time. I'm thinking of a triptych I made after a cycle trip around Tasmania. It was called The Road to Burnie. It was so clear. It was sort of a picture of a bulldozer, a dead Tasmanian devil squashed on the road, and a war memorial at Mole Creek. So they've had a sort of literal association with the images. And then they became, I think as I went to France, and Tasmania became a sort of an imaginary place, certainly in the middle of this big city. My memories and my feelings about it sort of changed in a way. I remember walking up to the facade, or I used to go past the facade of Notre Dame on my weekly walk to get some of my flowers from the market on the left. And they had scaffolding up above it, and it was all doing a sort of incredible ripple in the wind, all this covering over the scaffolding. And I just immediately thought of being on a mountaintop here, on a big walk, and this sense of the ripple. It was happening a bit yesterday, coming out of the mountains with that strong westerly. Everything was sort of rippling, the grass and the clouds. And quite amazingly yesterday, these big cloud shadows were running along the road in front of me, almost at my speed. It was incredibly dynamic. I think that's partly to do with that sort of titling, although Imaginary Landscape is clearly about, almost like about the loony cartoon of people in suburban Melbourne looking at the Wilderness Society calendar on their wall and making identification with wilderness or something, but they're never going to go there. But there it is, there on their calendar or whatever. I haven't seen that Johannes show down there in Inveresk at the moment, but he was a master at it, I think. he had to go and risk his life, and in the end it killed him, to bring back images of all of this terrain that we've been talking about, to show people just how amazing it was. Although all the images are like specifically the Gordon splits #1 or whatever, to the people looking at them, they're this fantastical world of light and shadow and water and fluvial excess.
And largely, as you say, inaccessible to them.
Yeah, who's going to go to the Gordon splits other than Matt or Grant Dixon? Or amazing.
Just one last question about France. What took you there, and what were you doing there, and how long were you there?
It was a big project and a incredible period in my life. And it's so subjective around just my head and my, nobody else really. It's just amazing to think about it. I overdid it with this sort of 1980s full-on, fill every moment of the day. It was such an active time, and so many issues around evolving Indigenous rights and the bicentennial, and my screen printing went berserk. And I thought, I can't sustain this stuff. And I was chair of Contemporary Arts Society at Tasmania, Contemporary Art Services, trying to maintain that. I was in meetings in Launceston, in battles about resources. Launceston seemed to have missed out on. Anyway, so I thought, hang on, this isn't going to work. And it coincided with getting a job back at the art school, full-time, tenured, so quite amazing. I thought, I'm going to turn to my etching. It's as I've said a number of times now, it's just there, slowly processing things, working things. And I thought, no, I've learnt it out of books or from some artists, some lecturers who learned it out of books. That sense of authenticity isn't there. And I knew about this studio in Paris where it was. They'd been working for 100 years, working with Chagall and Henry Moore and Miro, all the great modernists in a way. I knew this place existed. George Balderson, the famous Melbourne artist that died very young, had been there. And somebody my lovely friend Ian Westacott went there in the 1980s. So I knew about it. So I thought, I've got to go there. And I thought, now how am I going to do this? I got a fellowship from the Australia Council, which was pretty amazing. It was about $35,000 then. And I said in my fellowship I wanted to go and finish an etching of an artist that had worked in Paris in 1860s or something, Melion. And he had some images that were, and again, it's a beautiful thing about etching. It's a sort of staging. And he's just drawn a bit of Notre Dame, and then the rest of it breaks into whiteness that you can read as sky, or you can read as sort of metaphysical zone of the world and the imagination. I said I wanted to go there and finish that, and I wanted to do it at this workshop. And all sorts of planets lined up because the university had just set up the Cité studio. I was the second person there. And gee, it changed my life really. 3 or 4 months there working. And then the Atelier invited me back for a big Works on Paper fair to be their main artist in 96. Under the Eiffel Tower, they had this big thing called Saga. It was a sort of a Works on Paper fair. And that was one of my biggest moments, I think. Making work, they commissioned some work, and then I had all this other work that I got right into. The big spectacle of nature work that I'd made as a bridge between Tasmania and about the remarkable cave down in Tasmanian School. Yeah, so once I got there, and as I said, I think the 96 one I came home on the big container ship just to get it all fitting into a global, get the relationship working between the south, the southern hemisphere and the north. And then I was into it. I would take leave. I went about 12 times, really, through to 2006 when the workshop collapsed completely. But then by then I was in this, it was going to be Queenstown. It was time to really, it was quite nice in the end, sort of coincidence that Queenstown was on the radar. I don't think I've quite finished answering the question, but it's such a big thing for me, that whole Paris thing. But in the end, I sort of lived out there in transit lounges and temporary dwellings, and it's a bit too much. And in a sense, there was just no connection. There are all sorts of funny little historical ones around the French explorers here and all the naming, things like that. But my life there, in my head, in books, making these incredible etchings that are all in my drawer, that I'd pay 150 euros each to have them printed, because you never touched the presses or anything. It was all about you working upstairs in the room where Miro and Chagall and Henry Moore worked. And then there were these other international artists around you at the same time, beautiful German guy. Then once you've got that plate ready, you book a time, you go downstairs into the engine room of the print, the big presses, and there were about 4 printers. Sometimes you work with Luc, or sometimes you work with Louis. Wow, incredible. But it's all gone, so that's another thing about it too.
When I spoke to you, when I was setting up the podcast, you said that you had, had your focus on your international way of thinking, and then you were focusing more on the local now. So, you probably, kind of need the tension of the other, or the experience of the other, to probably...
Oh, yeah, for sure. Yeah, I don't regret anything.
No, it sounds like you've had a good time.
I've had a lucky life, I think, yeah.
Thank you so much for coming along, Raymond. It was really interesting.
Great. Okay, Sarah.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Art Destinations Tasmania. Make sure you listen to part 1 with Raymond Arnold, and be reminded about our next episode by subscribing to our fortnightly newsletter on our website artdestinations.org. I'm your host, Sarah Rhodes. Ciao for now.